You're listening to the Subrogation Support Network, a podcast from Mattison, Wickert & Layer, America's subrogation law firm, with dissemination of new developments and changes in subrogation law, as well as emerging trends and best practices. Here's your host, Ashton Kirsch.
Hello, everybody, and thank you once again for joining us on today's episode of the Subrogation Support Network podcast. It is me, your host, Ashton Kirsch, attorney with Mattison, Wickert & Layer, and I am pleasured and honored to have Darren DeMaria with DCI joining me today to discuss the wonderful world of vehicle appraisals, total loss valuations, underwriting valuations, and diminution in value. Fascinating stuff we're going to discuss today. Darren, how you doing?
Good, Ashton. Thank you.
Good. Well, thanks for joining me today. So just to briefly go into it, why don't you give me a quick introduction to yourself? Tell me about yourself and what you're doing over at DCI.
Sure. Well, and thank you kindly for having me on. I have been in and around the insurance valuation industry for about 39 years. I am currently the founder and chief client officer at DCI Solution. I am an expert witness, certified appraiser, certified master surveyor, certified farm and ag appraiser. We specialize in heavy equipment. I'm a certified diminished value expert, arbitrator, auto claims mediator, and umpire. That is a mouthful. But basically, we help insurance companies and individuals in establishing valuations on vehicles, total loss valuations, underwriting valuations, diminishment in value, collision estimates and repairs. So anything to do with the valuation, if you will, of a vehicle is really our expertise here at DCI Solution.
And the reason why I thought this would be a great conversation to have, even though it's not directly subrogation related, is because valuations, be it the appraisal, the total loss valuation, these are all things we need to confront when we're handling subrogation claims, right? A lot of times there may be a front end dispute as to, be it through the appraisal or whether that vehicle should have been totaled. So subrogation adjusters and, those who handle subrogation in general, they need to understand how this process works, how you folks go about coming up with these appraisals, these total loss valuations. And then at the end, I think, Darren and I actually just was it last year, maybe the year before, we did a really interesting presentation on diminution in value and whether or not it's recoverable, when it's recoverable, and kind of the process for evaluating it. So I definitely wanted to set some time aside at the end to go through that. Right, Darren?
Yep, absolutely. It is something that the industry really needs to be aware of, and when they need to pay or not to pay in some cases as well, for sure.
Yeah, so let's start with appraisals. So walk me a bit through what you're doing for appraisals, who you're working for, and what that process looks like.
Okay. So one of the main founding services when I founded the company about 10 years ago was focusing on total loss valuations, and specifically vehicles that are outside of a regular standard auto. So your standard auto would be your Hondas and Toyotas. But our forte is really anything outside of that, from custom, classic, antique, exotic, collectible type vehicles to farm equipment, construction equipment, a lot of heavy equipment, trucks and trailers, and a variety of unique type vehicles, the side-by-sides and boats and bikes and homemade vehicles, if you will. Those are the ones that really are a challenge to establish a valuation on for both the individual consumer when they're looking to write or get insurance on that particular vehicle, or for the insurance company themselves to, in the event of a loss, determine what the fair market value of that vehicle may be. And when I like to say or use the term, it's all about the details, because it truly is when it comes to unique pieces of equipment or vehicles of that nature. because they're all different. They're all unique, if you will. Even trucks and trailers. So depending on if it's an over-the-road truck, they could have several different engines, transmissions, axle ratings, horsepower, and that type of stuff, those specs, that's, spec information greatly affects the value. And if some of that information is not correct or related to us, the valuation could be off by literally tens of thousands of dollars. So we like to say it's all about the details and taking it to that extent, doing the homework, and finding out exactly what those vehicles have on them or what they're made up of. So that's absolutely crucial.
Yeah, and so we see this quite often, Darren, when it comes to making subrogation claims. And we'll get pushback, and this is a lot of my commercial auto clients. This is where there's a ton of pushback, and it's with these tractors and trailers where they're not as well known as maybe the standard, Sonata or the Chevy Cruze or whatever it could be,
Correct.
Where there's a lot of different examples. You can find valuation metrics just by Googling a lot of things, right? And Kelly Blue
Yes.
Books is even right there.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to these, high-end trailers, right? These commercial autos, a lot of times there's going to be different specifications, even on one trailer. There could be 15, 20 different, add-ons and additions. And it's just, I've seen valuation disputes where I've been involved with the adverse carrier going back and I say, hey, we've paid, this is what we've incurred on this total loss. It's $55,000 based upon, these three other vehicles or whatever. It could be the three other trailers. And then they come back and say, no, here's the other three trailers we found. And then we have to dig into it. And you find out, oh, it's because, there was chrome plating on the boards of this one. And this one had this. And this reefer unit had some specific, equipment involved in the reefer component. So there's just so many different things that, those disputes happen all the time.
That is correct. And unlike a regular standard auto, a lot of things can be determined from the VIN number itself, the VIN number when it comes off the assembly line from the manufacturer. Certainly, you can tell the year, make, and model of the vehicle. And again, a regular standard auto, you could tell a lot more things, the engine size, the horsepower, because they're all the same. But when it comes to those heavy equipment trucks or trailers, as you mentioned, when they come off the assembly line, they come off as literally a cabin chassis. And they go one way and it has a dump truck put on it. They go another way, it has an RV put on it. It goes another way, it has a cement mixer put on it. Those are things that you cannot tell by the VIN number because they are what we call aftermarket items, okay, or upgrades that are not done by the manufacturer. So where a standard auto, a lot of those things can be determined by the VIN number. Once you get outside of a standard auto, heavy equipment, as mentioned, you cannot determine those. So it takes some additional legwork. You need to talk to perhaps the manufacturer that installed that dump box or cement mixer to find out when it was installed, and all of the specifications regarding that cement mixer. Okay, so there's a lot of different components that make up the value of something of that nature. So
right. In age isn't necessarily the same for every piece of equipment, right? Obviously, a dump truck may have a significantly longer useful life than a Kia, right? I mean, there's just a lot of different factors that go into this, right?
And you mentioned the dump truck. So the cabin chassis, if I have a company that has a fleet of trucks, they may interchange some of those parts as well. So if one of those dump trucks was involved in an accident and the dump body itself is still in good shape, they may salvage that dump body and put it on another cabin chassis. So the dump box and the chassis itself may be two completely different years. So once again, that is also something that needs to be considered in these types of evaluations. So correct.
And what are the primary difficulties that you see in doing these valuations?
Well, it's getting the information related to us, whether it is from the vehicle owner, from the insurance company, from the IA, from the dealer. It's all about getting it, relayed to us and so we can properly take it into consideration. And in some cases, if it's a total burn, there's nothing left to look at. So we need to rely on, the vehicle owner to provide us with perhaps bills and receipts, documentation as to when these aftermarket items were put on these vehicles. So it's all about, again, I hate to continue to use the term, but it's all about the details and proof in some cases that, they did have these upgrades or special equipment on these vehicles.
I always get pushback on these claims, especially in the commercial auto context, where they, the reports just really differ, right? The defendant's report, when they're coming up with the valuation, and ours, where, their approach is going to be based on a very different geographical footprint, right? How do you consider geography in these things? When you're trying to find comparable market price, does geography play a major role? And if so, how does that impact you?
Sure, it absolutely does. More so on a standard auto than a heavy equipment, because when I say heavy equipment, that could be an over-the-road truck or, a crane, those sorts of things. And there is a limited amount of what you're kind of referring to, comparables, right? So if we're doing a Toyota valuation, there's usually a substantial amount of comparables, whether it's Chicago or Miami or Los Angeles, right? And the values will vary slightly depending on those areas. When we're talking about a piece of heavy equipment, a vehicle of that nature, a owner may drive several states to find a comparable, and that is in fact acceptable. So there is differences in value based upon geographical regions. There's also some Department of Insurance regulations around that. California has certain DOI regs that, a couple of years ago, they came out, all of their diesel engines need to be CARB compliant. So you could not use at that time a comparable vehicle from any other state because it wasn't comparable. School buses in California, they have certain safety standards, unlike any other state. So you cannot use a comparable school bus from Arizona or Nevada for a California claim. So we need to obviously be aware of all of those, uniqueness, not only from DOI perspective, but also a true comparable vehicle perspective as well.
Right, because the cost of to just go out on the market and purchase a vehicle, say that Chevy Cruze in Wyoming, may be different from that one in Florida. So are you considering those factors when you're putting forward these estimates? Or are you primarily just looking for, the most reasonable value or recent sold or, listed vehicle? How does that process work? So I'm always kind of curious when I'm looking at these reports.
Sure, no doubt. It all starts with the local market area. Where the vehicle owner resides is where we begin to build our valuation. So if we have that, I think it was a Chevy Cruze that you mentioned in Wyoming, if we have enough Chevy Cruzes to satisfy our valuation needs, then the valuation is completed. But if we need to expand the search out to find those comparable vehicles, or even speak to local Chevy dealers in Wyoming to justify the value, that's how it's done. So an auto versus a heavy equipment, even though the process is the same, we start with the local market area and work out geographically from there. So the process is the same, but it may vary per vehicle type on how far we actually extend out that search.
Interesting. So obviously geography matters. And another thing that matters that we always get pushback, pretty often on is the time frame, right? It's all right. Are we looking at, because with post-COVID, we have something that's super unique that's gone on where the price of vehicles has fluctuated so substantially, right? Prior to COVID, the increase in used car prices, I mean, it skyrocketed. And then since that time, it's, it's remained static or even slowly deflated. So, I mean, the time at which that report is run it's huge, right? And we've had pushback where, my client provides an appraisal, our review, our total loss valuation maybe is based upon the date of loss, which maybe occurred, right? Mid COVID, right? When these prices were highly elevated. And then the defendants providing a report based on, today, or maybe even 6 months later when they got the case. And, and typically, and in the past, the differentials weren't really that significant, but today they really can be. Have you seen quite a bit of that? And what are your thoughts there?
Well, most definitely. And as mentioned, in my 39 years of doing this, during the COVID period was absolutely crazy. And really, for the most part, the first time you've ever seen that big of an increase in valuations across the board. Not only standard auto, but trucks and trailers and boats and everything was at an all-time high, literally an all-time high. New cars were going for 50% over, MSRP, and people were buying those cars. And historically, as you may know, when you drove a vehicle off the lot, it depreciated, anywhere between, 10 to 20% as soon as you drove it off the lot. And then, as years go on, it would depreciate, after that. It was never an appreciating asset. It was always a depreciating asset. And again, for that COVID period, everything was sky high. There was supply and demand issues and a whole number of other things, but vehicles have absolutely come down since then. Really everything, standard auto and trucks and trailers and the whole market is, I don't want to say it's back to normal or pre-COVID, but it's certainly a lot closer than it has been in the past, for sure.
Yeah, and there's a crazy few years there. And I'm sure in the valuation field, it was even more nuts than most of us see.
Oh, it was wild. And, the problem is those individuals that purchased a vehicle during that time, they purchased it at an all-time high. And kind of getting back to your point now, if they purchased it at that all-time high and have suffered a loss now, the insurance company is obligated to pay them, to your point, at the date of loss, not the date or what they purchased the vehicle for, but at the date and time of the loss. What was that vehicle worth at the date of loss is what they are obligated to pay.
And given significant price fluctuations, I have no idea, but I would imagine that there's going to be some pretty upset, be it insureds or other folks, because they may have a loan that exceeds that value, which is more, it happens all the time, but it's more likely now as you have people that purchased at these crazy prices. And now, as things settle out, where they're having losses and things are occurring. So you seeing a bunch of animosity on that or pushback?
Unfortunately, yes. And that is not the insurance company's fault. That's certainly not our fault. That's just what the market, dictates, right? So yes, it is unfortunate for those folks that are, upside down in those situations.
Yeah, and it's my understanding that you also do with, the contested claims, right? What's your role there, and how do you, walk me through kind of the process of what you do on a day-to-day handling these cases?
Sure. So what you're referring to is we do a lot of appraisal clause. So when either the vehicle owner invokes the appraisal clause or even the carrier can invoke the appraisal clause. And what that appraisal clause is, to take a step back, is if you are, and I'm kind of summarizing the policy language, if you're not happy with the amount of loss that your insurance company is offering you, you can invoke what they call as the appraisal clause. And what that means is that the individual needs to go out and hire their own independent appraiser to represent them in the appraisal clause. and the insurance company needs to hire an independent appraiser to represent them in the appraisal clause. And according to that policy language, the two appraisers must be competent. There is no special licensing that is required or certification that is required. But I will say that everybody on our team is either a certified appraiser or licensed adjuster in any and all states that we do business with or have any sort of special requirements. So we represent both parties, both the insurance company as well as the vehicle owner, if necessary, in these right of appraisal cases.
And you mentioned competence, and I can agree. Your team is great. I love working with you guys. But I would imagine that everyone may not be so competent. Any comments on the industry and other, folks that you may go, I don't want to say go against, but have on the other side, like any major industry issues that you're aware of that you see in maybe reviewing what other appraisers are doing or, what they should be doing differently or better?
Sure. And with all due respect to my fellow colleagues in the industry, the word competent is pretty vague. And in a vetting process, they are supposed to be unbiased as well, right? And our job as appraisers is to come up with the fair market value of the vehicle, okay, without being biased. And that is what both of those independent appraisers are supposed to do. Well, depending on who is paying you, you tend to be a little bit more biased, unfortunately, in those types of scenarios. So unfortunately, and also getting back to the competent piece of that, in one of my vetting process, which we were actually vetting one of the other individuals, what are your qualifications? Why are you competent to represent the vehicle owner in this case? It says here that you work for a roofing company in Texas. Right. And this individual said, well, every roofer in Texas knows the value of a pickup truck. So I guess that could fall into the competent appraiser, but I'm not sure. So that might be a stretch, but those are things that we run into on a daily basis where competent is a word that is yet to be determined sometimes.
I think it's like, it when you see it, right? I mean, but yeah, no, you're right. I've seen some crazy appraisals from some firms that claim to be, the experts in the industry. And then you find out, guys, Joe's a roofer down in Texas and he just knows. It's a gut feeling, right? My knee starts to hurt when I know a vehicle is the appropriate valuation. I don't know, but there are some really, unique ones we see where, you can tell from that report that this appraiser, this individual attesting to valuation is truly just, they've came up with a conclusion and they're now finding things to fit into that conclusion, right, which is not the way that these things are to be handled. You are right. Your job is to provide a fair and independent evaluation and an appraisal. And a lot of times these, and I don't want to say plaintiff side appraisers because, it goes any which way. But a lot of times, these plaintiffs appraisers, they're coming up with, here's the conclusion I want. Now I'm going to find some inputs to put in. And frankly, that's really easy to do. That's a sad truth. But it's also equally easy for, me as the attorney, you as the other appraiser, to take a look at that and realize exactly what they were doing. They were picking and choosing, of a very, very broad range and set of similar vehicles to find a way to give that valuation they want.
Right. And, the internet is a wonderful thing, and there's a lot of information out there. And to your point, you can find information or comparable vehicles to suit your needs, whether it's high or low, right? And depending on what side of the fence you're on, if you're representing the vehicle owner, you're looking for the highest dollar amount, because you need to, or they need to justify, the cost that the vehicle owner is paying them for their appraisal. So it's all, again, kind of getting back to those details. Are you finding the highest quote comparable vehicles out there? And are they truly comparable? Are you making an adjustment for those options, mileage, and condition, making them comparable, to the lost vehicle? So those are things that absolutely need to be taken into consideration. You could go online and Google a whatever Freightliner, and you can get stuff from 30,000 to 80,000. And it all depends on those conditions and specs and everything else. So, again, the internet's a wonderful thing, but it's also, what is the market truly saying? You need to look at more than, one or two sources. We keep a history of every evaluation that we've done since we started the company. There's a number of other valuation resources, online that we may utilize. We may take a look at some auction data or JD Power data, those sorts of things, and, our historical data, and really come up with that fair market valuation. It's not about the highest comp out there. And again, usually the highest comp out there is not what we're looking at in the comparison.
Yeah, and I mean, because that can have a huge impact on the final valuation. I was looking at a case, I'd say it was probably just a few months ago, where we're reviewing the adverses report on this, and we're taking a look. And why is it that this trailer that is so obviously worth $45,000 post salvage, why is this now, coming out of the adverses report at 65 grand? And reviewing everything, and I'm just trying to figure out, you dig into the numbers, and then you find out one of their exemplars, they actually had a brand new tag on there. So it was actually listed at I think it was like $75,000 on a trailer that you Google, and you can tell right away that this is, potentially between the 35 and 50,000 max range. Well, guess what? That $75,000 valuation, when you're only looking at three vehicles, that's one of three. That's impacting this number hugely, right? So that's where I think adjusters and people in the industry and attorneys need to know what they're looking for and like what inputs are essential here so that they can appropriately review these things.
No doubt. Absolutely. It's when even on a standard auto, there's a lot of differences. Mileage is, a big factor, and options, in condition. Teslas, as an example, they have the self-driving option. Okay, that certainly you can't tell by the VIN number, and you can't tell, by a lot of the data, right? And that's a $15,000 option, brand new. So if that wasn't indicated, nobody would know that vehicle had the self-driving option. The other thing with the self-driving option is you can purchase that new, or you can basically, it's a subscription that you could subscribe to as well on a monthly basis. So whether they purchased it or whether they subscribe to it are two completely different valuations. So
interesting. So what you're doing is, I've seen your reports and all of the reports, and ultimately you're finding the most, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Darren, you're finding the most appropriate exemplar vehicles, or whatever term you'd want to use for that, the similar, make, model, kind, quality. And from there, you're making any sort of, be it deductions or deviations to dollar value, either adding to that or reducing from it to come to terms and make that vehicle exactly similar, or as substantially similar as possible to that which you're being asked to evaluate, right?
Yep, that is correct. And some of those factors, again, are condition and mileage and options, making the two vehicles equal. Correct.
And I'm sure technology and the new technology packages, and as we have these self-driving vehicles, as you stated, is going to make that even more complex and even more interesting. I mean, we have fully autonomous vehicles. I actually have a whole presentation, and we've actually done a podcast on that already. But fully autonomous vehicles on the roadway. You can go to San Francisco and you can get into a fully autonomous cab. Door opens, you click go, it takes you somewhere. And I mean, it's going to be fascinating to see, with just the extent of one, obviously factory authorized, and you could say factory installed, different tech packages, right? We're going to see more and more of them. Plus, we're going to see a lot of aftermarket stuff for vehicles. You discussed having some kind of unique vehicles you review. It's going to be interesting, right?
It's going to be real interesting, without a doubt, in many different ways. Who's at fault for some of these accidents, and there's a lot to it, and you could probably speak to that a little bit more about who's at fault in some of those scenarios. But most definitely, there's going to be, we've, in my 39 years, I've seen a lot of different types of vehicles, right? And the future's going to be really wild as we get into that.
What's the most interesting vehicle you've been asked to evaluate? Anything? Just, you mentioned doing some aftermarket or customer made vehicles. I mean, anything come to mind?
We've done a 1901 steam car. We've done a lot of Barrett Jackson stuff, Chip Foose vehicles, a lot of custom builders for the SEMA show. We've done a lot of different tour buses for John Travolta and Steve Miller, Toby Keith, Heather Locklear. One of the kind of unique things that we've done fairly recently in the last couple months, we did I think it was an $80 million Tesla charging station. So we've done, a lot of unique things with wheels or tracks or wings. In just the last 10 years alone. So it's pretty wild. I've done Elvis Presley's, a lot of different celebrity cars, Sammy Davis, and just a variety of different things that's unique. So those are the things that, you may not see on the road on a daily basis, but they do come across our desk because that is really, our forte.
How do you even value those things? Are you looking at similar other celebrity? Let's think about the celebrity vehicle,
Sure.
right? Obviously, it's probably an antique anyway, and it has a value in that regard. But there's also I don't want to say sentimental value, because it's not really sentiment. It's more so, the value, the collectability of it, the fact that this was owned by somebody else. What goes into that, or is it just all really dependent on the specific vehicle?
Sure. Well, it depends on the vehicle and depends on the celebrity, but it also depends on the pedigree. Okay, so for the Elvis, it was a station wagon that he had custom made, and this was a couple of years ago. We actually had to contact Graceland and get the true documentation to prove that it was his car, right? Number one, and then what is the quote celebrity value, that's associated with that on top of a regular, Cadillac station wagon. So. Those are a challenge, if you will. You're not going to find, 3-4 comparables, right? And used to that. So it's more of building a report or documenting through different sources the valuation itself, versus the, Toyota Camry, if you will.
Now, are you also looking at, let's say, if you're comparing two similar celebrities who have maybe sold similar cars at different periods of time, are you looking into all of that as well and kind of analyzing, those factors? I mean, that's really interesting. I'd almost love to see how that works. And I've yet to have the opportunity to deal with one of those on the subrogation end, but that's cool stuff.
Yeah. And it does, again, it's the process, although we would like to say it's the same, hey, let's find comparables. Well, there are no comparables. It was a special custom build for whatever celebrity, so we would need to take all of that into consideration and kind of, it's almost like a piece of art, when you're talking about something of that caliber. Well, can you compare it to another Van Gogh? Well, yes and no, depending on the time period it was done. So there's a lot of things that really come into play, and you have to really build, as you can appreciate, build your case as to how you came up with the value based upon perhaps auction data, Barrett-Jackson data, other celebrity data. There's a lot more that goes into an evaluation of that means for sure. But it's fun stuff.
Yeah, so I know you also do it to jump subjects, well, related, but a little bit different, is just the underwriting valuations, as you discussed, where there's a lot of times where, on my end, and this is maybe more subro related, we have, I work for a lot of insurers who insure specialized, more exotic vehicles, be it high value or collectibles. And ultimately, they have a stated value policy, right? Where it's, this vehicle is insured to 250, right? So there's a loss, total loss, they pay in the 250,000. The hard part there is when I'm proving up that subrogation claim, even when it's so obvious this vehicle was, be it underinsured at the stated value, or whatever it could be, that we still need to prove up what that market value is. The defendant's not just going to usually take our word for that. They're going to know, well, sure, you paid $250,000, but it was stated value. It's not based on be it the market value, the ACV, whatever it would be. So, it's my understanding you deal with those things too, right?
We do. We work with both insurance companies and individuals, and depending on, the carrier, in many cases, the carrier may request that the owner themselves prove the value of whatever it is. We do a lot of vintage motorcycle work in that regards, and we do a lot of high-end exotic valuations or underwriting, appraisals for that very same reason. And it could be some celebrities, mixed in there as well. And once again, that process is somewhat the same. Hey, whether it's a Ferrari or Lamborghini or a 65 Mustang or what have you, it's building that case, building that value. What, historically have these vehicles been going for? We may take, depending on the year of it, if it's a couple years old, we may take some depreciation factors into consideration. We may take some appreciation factors into consideration, depending on, what it is and where it is. So those are, again, kind of in that same category of, I don't want to say the one-offs, but, a lot of times they are one-offs because they're unique pieces for sure.
And are you coming in at the front end, working with underwriting with the carriers? They're trying to figure out what that stated value should be?
Yes. So in that scenario, yes. And, I mentioned, we would reach out to Barrett-Jackson and stuff like that. I've spoke to Jay Leno on fire trucks, and, I spoke to a number of the folks that you see on the car shows and Gas Monkey Garage and, American Pickers and those guys that are, that deal in those types of vehicles or motorcycles, to kind of get their opinion on different things. So it's, they may be a little bit closer to the market on that, but it's a source that we can rely on, and another fellow expert, if you will, in the industry to help us establish the valuation on something like that. So a credible source.
So I know who to reach out to now. Darren, I'm going to contact you and have you connect me with Jay Leno to serve as my expert witness as to the value of whatever it's, or maybe, what's it, American Pickers. That's the beauty of technology. I just looked at my phone. I didn't remember the names of the guys. We got Mike Wolf and Frank Fritz. I called them up and be like, hey, I need we found this fancy motor, this Indian motorcycle in a garage, give me a value. So you'll connect me with those folks, right?
Absolutely. And Mike was a great resource. And we did I think it was a 1901 Militor motorcycle with a sidecar. It was actually being donated to a museum in, I believe it's in Massachusetts somewhere. So a couple of years ago. And, he was a wealth of knowledge, and he turned me on to another guy who had since passed away. But, those guys literally live and breathe, those vintage motorcycles as an example. So what a great resource. And they can tell you everything about it. And with that also came that pedigree that I was referring to. So it had, handwritten notes from the builder from, I think it was 1901, when they originally took it on a test drive. So, the more documentation that you could have to go along with the appraisal on something of that nature, the more value add, right?
That's excellent. I mean, so you obviously are the expert or the appraiser for these general vehicles, but you also can go deeper and you know the right people to ask.
Sure.
That's where I deal with quite a few complex wooden boat subrogation claims. It's
Sure.
kind of like a sub-practice specialty of mine where, obviously there's wooden boat damage. I mean, these things are anywhere between, 100,000 and, $10 million for
Right.
these old antique wooden boats. And sadly, they get damaged all the time because sadly, I mean, a lot of these facilities where they're being stored or the marinas where they're kept, they don't necessarily know the specific things that go into maintaining a wooden boat. And it's fascinating to see how some of these people just gather this expertise where I've got a guy, actually, I live, Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, and I have a guy that's one of the wooden boat experts of the world where I can just call him up and he knows everything. The stuff that he knows
Exactly.
is just fascinating. So it's not always about what you know. It's also about who you know and who you can ask on these things. And that goes, frankly, with all areas of claim subrogation, right? We want to have the right experts and the right people for the right job.
No doubt about it. And, something of that nature, I remember we did a claim. It was at a Barrett Jackson in Arizona. And there was a gentleman in a Toyota ran into and it was Delaney. I don't know the year of it, but it was like a $5-6 million car, and they just tapped the fender. Okay, well, to your point, well, how do you come up with a value on something like that? Well, you really can't, because they had to manually manufacture this fender. Okay, so it's not like you go to an auto parts store and buy a Delaney fender, right? So
Right.
they had to manually make it, and that happens a lot. So, geez, what's it worth? Well, what's somebody's time and effort? And it may take a year to manufacture something like that because it's all handmade and hand built. So it's a unique world for sure.
I think that's the perfect transition, Darren, into diminution in value and diminished value claims. Obviously, we talk about that fender, right? And that
Mhm.
antique vehicle, incredibly valuable. There's only a few of them left. Well, guess what? Not one of them was in a collision, right? So the assumption that, is the sad truth is a lot of insurance carriers, a lot of folks out in the industry, whom I represent, kind of take a different approach to what I do. I mean, I think that there is a viable cause of action in most jurisdictions for diminished value, right? We talk about that exact vehicle, right? No doubt. I mean, when somebody's purchasing that antique vehicle after the fact, they're going to put some value or some negative connotation on the fact that this one was in a collision. If you have the choice between, just generally speaking, two vehicles, one that the insurance carrier just spent $15,000 repairing rear end collision, and the other one that's never been in a collision. Which one are you going to buy? I can speak for myself. I'm going to buy the one that was never in the collision, all else held constant. So diminished value is a big thing. It's getting to be even bigger in the industry. Obviously our firm has a ask a question button on our website where adjusters and attorneys around the country can just ask us questions, and we give, opinions based on the books we publish, the charts we have, and without giving true legal advice, giving some insight on basic things. And one thing that we get hundreds of questions about every year is our diminution in value chart. And more states are, precedent is coming down. Obviously, Georgia was the first one where they basically said, yes, there is a viable claim for diminished value. And more states are going along with it. The vast majority of states, it's ambiguous, right? There's no case law or regulation one way or the other, but it's starting to fall and become more common. So, given that that's the case, walk me through what services you provide to clients related to diminution in value.
Sure. So we absolutely provide diminishment in value appraisals, both for, again, insurance companies and individuals. And, to your point, and kind of maybe taking a step back real quick before we jump into diminishment in value. So we talked about total loss, and the Department of Insurance, with respect to total loss, many different states have the guidelines, if you will. This is how you need to perform a total loss valuation. NADA and Kelly Blue Book and DCI Solution and CCC and Mitchell and Solera, those are all recognized total loss valuation sources with approved methodologies for total loss. there is nothing in any state or any department of insurance that has any of those guidelines as it applies to diminishment in value. So right then and there, it's a gray area. And at the end of the day, it's a matter of opinion, really. So which makes it difficult for the entire industry to prove who's right. The old school thinking is, geez, the vehicle was involved in an accident. It has been repaired back to industry standards. It's got all new parts. It shouldn't, there should be no depreciation, right? Well, to your example, geez, if this car had $15,000 and this car did not, of course it's going to be worth or should be worth less. And which one would I buy, right? So it all comes down to our methodology. We take a look at the specific vehicle, but more importantly, the specifics of the accident, the estimate of repair. So what, in fact, was damaged and what was the severity of the damage? So was it that fender? Okay, well, that was fixed. Or was it severe structural damage or frame damage or airbag deployment? Those are things that we look at because those are really the driving factors in how much that vehicle has actually depreciated in value. We also look at the other side. Hey, just because it was involved in an accident, what happened? The windshield was replaced, or the mirror was replaced, or the wheel was replaced. Well, those things may not have the same impact in diminishment of value as the frame damage or structural damage and those sorts of things. I mean, you could have an $8,000 estimate on a brand new Lincoln, and the only thing that was replaced was the $7,000 headlamp. Well, that really didn't depreciate the value of the vehicle by just replacing the headlamp. So you need to, once again, look at the details and the specifics of the estimate of repair as it pertains to the vehicle in question.
Right. And especially, with the sensors now on vehicles, the Teslas, right? These more complex technology-driven vehicles where if you hit one of these sensors, they have to replace it. I mean, it's one, there's a replacement of the sensor, which is incredibly expensive. Two, there's recalibration. Three, there's maybe software updates and different things that need to occur. So what was previously, you see a $10,000 invoice, you can assume, oh yeah, there was something major that happened to this vehicle, suggestive of potentially there being some sort of viable diminution in value claim. Today, you'd have to go deeper than that because quite obviously, I was looking at a Tesla fender recently, and it was a fender that would have been a $300 part if it was on just, I think the comparable I had was a Volkswagen, right? A non-smart vehicle.
Sure.
Well, that fender was $300 on that Volkswagen. It was $3,700 without the actual labor on the Tesla, right? And don't quote me on those numbers, but they're relatively consistent. But that huge differential means that there's a lot more digging, right? So I agree with you. Just because, when previously a lot of times folks in the industry and plaintiffs' attorneys would use like a 10 or a 10% number where they'd say, hey, if there's damage, 10%, of the vehicle value is going to be the diminution of value. It's like, that's ridiculous, right? I think that there is a valid claim in most jurisdictions for diminution, but that would actually require there to be some sort of impact or some sort of damage to that vehicle that goes beyond just there being damage and goes to the point where would that impact a reasonable buyer's decision to purchase, right? I had a vehicle recently, my wife's vehicle that was rear-ended, right? And, caused significant damage, and, full repair was, $15,000 dollars in damage, where, given the full rebuild of the back end of that vehicle, it's going to have diminution. But when it comes down to the other claim that I had a few years ago where somebody just rammed a shopping cart into the side door of my car, well, that one I would say would be very difficult to argue that a reasonable buyer would have a concern if that was just solely superficial, door damage or damage to the door. Right, Darren?
You're absolutely correct, without a doubt. And, some of the driving factors in the industry are, the Carfax or vehicle history reports. And they're a great resource, of information, but they don't give you those details that go along with that information. And what I mean by that is, the Carfax could say major damage, minor damage, moderate damage. Well, who decides that, number one, those different categories, and how can we distinguish between the parking lot scratch and that vehicle being T-boned without the actual estimate of repair, the true documentation? So you cannot say, okay, well, that vehicle depreciated 30% because I found other cars that have an accident history. Well, once again, you don't know the accident history of those other cars. So how are you comparing it to the one in question? So, you just need to, it's not a true comparison by any means. So you need the details and the specifics of the loss or the vehicle in question.
And that's why I wanted to make sure we touched on this, because ultimately it's something you can assist with. If anyone out there has questions, contact Darren,
Sure.
Be it on the consumer or the insurance carrier end. Because I truthfully believe that these, diminution claims are going to end up being a huge thing going forward. One, just because more states are starting to recognize it. Also, it's kind of it's kind of like as the dominoes fall, more and more carriers are starting to stop saying, hey, we just don't pay it. And they're starting to, start negotiate these things. So we're going to see more and more claims arise from it as, frankly, the plaintiff's attorneys, start recognizing that. And the next thing is, I think that it's going to be really interesting to see the impact of, the new autonomous technology and the sensors and how that impacts the decision to purchase. Because in how that impacts diminution in value and diminished value, because previously, okay, yeah, frames damaged, there could be the potential that that could cause an issue in the future, causing a consumer to question that. But now that we have vehicles that could potentially, be driving you, right? Or that vehicle is the decision maker. That vehicle, what it does and how it functions, it has to be perfect, or that could be life and death. That could be where, okay, yeah, that slight damage caused by the shopping cart. Well, maybe that hit a sensor. And now maybe that's going to cause that consumer, that reasonable person out there to say, hold up, while previously maybe just some damage to a door would have absolutely not impacted anything, it could impact significantly the more we rely on those vehicles. Does that make sense, Darren? Does that cause any insights from you?
And you mentioned, the sensors. If that sensor didn't deploy the airbag for whatever reason, right, because it was damaged in the loss, that could absolutely be fatal in some cases. So without a doubt, there's a lot of things that today need to be considered, but, in the future, even more so.
Yeah, well, that sense, let's talk about just even lane assist technology now, right?
Yep.
Now with autonomous vehicles, these sensors it goes way beyond what I'm used to on my vehicle, where I have it turns green on the dashboard, and that means that it's sensing the two lanes, and I can take my hand off the wheel if I need to grab my coffee cup, right? But guess what? If that's functioned only 99% of the way, or if there was just some slight damage or scratch on the lens, I don't know the technology behind it, but that obviously could create a catastrophic condition, which is unique from the way that vehicles were prior to this kind of crazy change in technology.
Without a doubt.
So no, that's really everything I wanted to touch on today, Darren. Is there anything else that you wanted to add before we tie this thing up?
No, actually, I just wanted to thank you for the time today and the discussion and your ongoing support. And it's a changing, ever-changing world that we live in. So it's always good to stay on top of these things and have these types of discussions for the entire industry. So thank you again.
Absolutely. Well, if anyone has any questions for me, obviously, you know who to reach out to. If you have questions for Darren or need some assistance with any of the things we discussed today, Darren with DCI, his whole team, they'd be happy to have a conversation with you. So Again, Darren, as always, it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for joining me today. Audience, thank you everyone in the audience. It's a pleasure. Until next time, this is Ashton Kirsch signing off from the Subrogation Support Network podcast. Thank you.